my name is Karen Walker-Simpson and I am the director of the Funder Safeguarding Collaborative. So the collaborative was launched in March 2021, and the aim is to promote listening and learning among funder organisations to strengthen safeguarding practice. So it's recognising that grant-making organisations, due to their funding and their relationships with a broad range of organisations, can have a really important influence on safeguarding practices. But often the resources and training and support that is out there isn't really tailored to grant-making organisations. So that's why we were established, and we are a global network of organisations, grant-making organisations, and we provide support and also as a mechanism for pooled investment around safeguarding. So I met with Jenny and Annalie, it's a long time ago, probably over a year ago now, to talk about how we could support Cumbria Community Foundation around their safeguarding. And what we talked about was the need to create ownership within the foundation around how you want to approach keeping people safe. There's no one size fits all approach, and it's got to be realistic and appropriate for the kind of organisation you are, the kind of organisations you fund, and the types of relationships that you have with the organisations you work with. So rather than me going away and revising your policy, we decided to do a series of participatory sessions, where we discussed kind of best practices around safeguarding and then worked out what made sense for CCF. And I have to say, all credit to Jenny. We had incredible engagement, so not just from the team, but also having the trustees attend different sessions, which is really important because the aim was to start building a safeguarding culture rather than just building a safeguarding policy. So it was really positive to see the engagement all around. So part of the process, before we even get into what as a group was decided that you would put in place, was around agreeing a definition for safeguarding. It's difficult as the definition has shifted and changed over recent years. So the definition that has been agreed on for CCF is that safeguarding means protecting people's health, well-being and rights so that everybody can live free from abuse and harm. But in terms of thinking about who we are safeguarding, actually the guidance from the Charity Commission has changed over recent years. So it used to focus primarily on children or adults at risk, who are those individuals who may be less able to protect themselves because they've got a disability, due to mental health issues, due to age or frailty. But actually that has now increased in terms of recognising that harm can happen to anyone depending on the situation, and that actually you don't want to cause harm to your supporters or for the work environment to be unsafe for volunteers, and you definitely want to make sure that beneficiaries and service users are safe. So your policy isn't specific on children and adults at risk, although there are some specific guidelines in there on that. What it aims to do is to provide guidance so that the team as a whole behave in safe and ethical ways and that keeps everybody safe, as well as those who might be in vulnerable circumstances or have specific risks of harm. And so in terms of what we're safeguarding people from, it's all forms of abuse and maltreatment. So often within safeguarding, there is a particular focus on ensuring that your staff and volunteers and others don't cause any kind of harm or abuse to the people that you come into contact with. And that's absolutely right, that you've got a duty of care and a responsibility to make sure that your work is safe and the organisations that you're working with are safe. But you may come through fundraising events or other activities, you may come across abuse in the community, which has nothing to do with what you're doing. That still requires a response, but it's not your duty to respond. That would be about referring it on to other agencies. So it's quite broad ranging, but your responsibilities primarily relate to your activities or ensuring that your are able to follow up if things are reported to them. So just why is safeguarding important? I'm sure people are aware of it. I think I've included a kind of screenshot of your impact report because I think it's important to frame safeguarding as part of the positive change that you want to see in the world. Sometimes I see safeguarding viewed as a compliance issue, and there is a compliance element that as a registered charity, you need to make sure that you're compliant with the Charity Commission requirements and also the requirements of other regulators. But fundamentally, keeping people safe is about having a positive impact in the world. And if actually what you're doing puts people at risk of harm or abuse, you're not going to have the impact that you want to have as an organisation. But there's also a reality in terms of the reputation and the organisation's risks as a whole. So two high-profile examples here. So Oxfam, when everything hit the headlines in 2018, lost millions of pounds in terms of revenue as a result of the safeguarding concerns. And it was even more severe in Kids Company. They'd been all over the press for many months around the general management of the organisation. But as soon as it was, Southwark issued a statement saying they were concerned about safeguarding issues, the charity actually, all their supporters and everybody withdrew at that point, and the charity actually closed 72 hours later. So it is fundamentally about your organisation, and it can have a real impact on your organisation, its reputation, and ultimately the stability and survival of the foundation and the work that it does. So within CCF, the aim, as I said before, the aim is to have a safeguarding culture rather than just a safeguarding policy. And what that means is that safeguarding isn't the responsibility of one individual. It actually there are responsibilities at different levels of the organisation. So for trustees and for yourselves as the committee with delegated authority from trustees, it's really important that safeguarding is seen as a governance priority, and that trustees and the committees monitor what is going on and hold the organisation accountable for making sure that the safeguards don't just exist on paper, but they actually exist in practice. And so there's different ways to do this, and I'll talk specifically around your role around monitoring this in terms of the grant making. But one of the key strategies for achieving trustees to have oversight is to have a designated lead who works closely with the wider team. And in this case, that's John Wilson. Underneath the trustees, it's really important that the leadership team also champion the importance of safeguarding and monitor at a more operational level that it's being implemented. And Jenny, as I said, has done a brilliant job in terms of leading that through the process that we've been through over the last year. And that would continue in terms of moving this forward through implementation. And then safeguarding, obviously, it's everybody's responsibility. So everybody should be thinking about, are the actions that I'm about to take, are the things that I'm doing safe? And if they've got any concerns, referring to the guidance that has been developed, or talking to Jenny or others about what they should be doing to make sure that the measures that their area of operation is safe. It's important to talk in terms of grantees. So with grantees, they are independent organisations. So it used to be that with a lot of funders who had implemented safeguarding policies, they would say to their grantees, oh, if you don't have a policy, then you need to sign up to ours, that you'll adhere to ours. But obviously, trusts and foundations are very different organisations to the organisations that you fund. And so what makes sense for you isn't going to make sense for the organisations that you fund. And also, your grantees may be working with groups who have particular vulnerabilities. They may have a completely different structure or size. And so it's important that they have their own policies and procedures rather than following yours. And the structure of that and the culture within the organisation will look different. But again, there should be, depending on the structure of the organisation, there should be responsibilities and a governance level, and people recognising that safeguarding and safety is critical to having a positive impact, that's championed at a leadership level, and that frontline staff are aware of their responsibilities and implementing safeguards across their work. So in terms of grant making, the Charity Commission requirements are here. So they expect you to have conduct proper checks and due diligence to make sure the organisations you fund have appropriate safeguards in place. They want you to have clear lines of responsibility for reporting and responding to safeguarding concerns. So when something goes wrong, who is that reported to? And that this should be set out in a written agreement or contract. So we had this in mind, even though I recognise, and we discussed this, that not all the organisations you fund are charities, but the Charity Commission guidelines provide a good benchmark as a starting point to consider what's reasonable for you to expect of the organisations we fund. But when we were developing this, we were really mindful. So the Funder Safeguarding Collaborative did a study in 2020 looking at what was a positive funder approach to safeguarding. And this 4 principles emerged from this. So first of all, as a funder, it's really important that you're clear what your expectations are and that you communicate those to grantees. So they're aware of this before they apply to you for funding, and they can use those guidelines in a positive way to strengthen their own practice. The requirements are not overly prescriptive or one size fits all, because it's really important that there's organisational ownership, that organisations aren't doing this because their funder says so, but they're doing it because it's important to their work. That the expectations are realistic and proportionate to the size of funding and the size of organisation, and that anyone who is assessing safeguarding or looking at safeguarding as part of the due diligence process has appropriate training and feels equipped to do that. So we looked at all the different requirements, and what we identified was 4 key areas to look at. So do the organisations you fund have appropriate policies and procedures? Are they making sure that their staff are suitable? Do they have systems in place so that if something goes wrong, they can report it? And then is there kind of governance and accountability to make sure that there's oversight of implementation? Although a big focus, and we'll talk about this today, is the application stage, it is important to recognise that you don't necessarily know everything at application stage. So the process that we agreed was that organisations would submit their policies as part of the application. That would be reviewed by the team, who would gather additional information if they required it. It would then go to the grants committee for approval. And then there would be clear terms and conditions and expectations in the grant agreement. And if any incidents came up, then those would be reported to CCF in terms of making sure that appropriate action is taken. It's not for the foundation to step in and take over, but it is about making sure that appropriate action is taken. So we wanted to make sure that because you do fund a broad range of organisations, both in terms of the size of the organisation and the size of the funding. So we spent a lot of time trying to work out what was proportional. So what we came up with, and this isn't all of the detail, there's more detailed guidance for the team, is there were certain areas that we considered essential that must be in place if funding is to be recommended. It might not be in the policy, but it might be in practice, because and actually it's the practice that keeps people safe, but actually it's important that organisations then document it in the policy, because that promotes consistency and acts as a guide for everybody working in the organisation. There are additional things, which is kind of amber, where these are important, but funding might be recommended if there are gaps in these areas, but you might put conditions on for the organisation to strengthen their safeguards to address this. And then finally, for organisations who are working with children or adults at risk, there's a higher level of expectation. And again, clear communication, so these expectations will be shared openly with grantees so they know what to expect. Try to make sure that they're not too prescriptive, so organisations can adapt them to their particular circumstances. By having these different levels, try to make sure that they're realistic. And then we've developed guidance for the team and also delivered some training. So from the feedback from Jenny, you're probably already aware of this, as I think a number of what the team are finding is that a number of the organisations actually don't have the essential elements within their safeguarding policy. And so that is then an updated policy as a condition of the funding of the grant award. And so there will be some delay in terms of funding not being issued until those are in place. So wanted just to finish by looking at the role of the grants committee. So the trustees, it's very clear that it's the trustees' role to make sure that policies, procedures and practices are in place and that they're fit for purpose. And so as a committee that has delegated authority for grant making, you would fall under this responsibility, which is from the Charity Commission requirements. So what this means is that it's your role to be asking the right questions. So when proposals or requests to approve funding are put before you, it's about asking whether safeguarding has been considered as part of the assessment, and I think that's now included as a standard part of the information that you receive, that the safeguards seem adequate. So again, this idea of proportionality, that they seem adequate for the nature of the work and the level of risk, and that's reflected in terms of any conditions or delay on funding. And also, does there need to be any follow-up in terms of supporting the grantee to address gaps? So we spoke about the different types of resources. It's not for Cumbria Community Foundation to be providing training and capacity building to grantees, but there are lots and lots of different resources out there. And so signposting organisations to where they can get help, but also just keeping it on the agenda in terms of talking to the organisations you're funding, in terms of how they're doing, any challenges that are coming up, and just providing them encouragement to keep on going. Safeguarding is always, people talk about it as safeguarding is a journey. And it's recommended that policies and procedures are updated. The Charity Commission requires that to be done every year, because you'll learn as you go along. And so it's important that, nobody's going to get it right first time. And so that process of just finding out what works and what doesn't, and updating your procedures and policies as you go along.